Hello and welcome into the GSMC Sports Podcast brought to you by the GSMC Sports Network. I'm your host, TJ Mabardi. Today is Wednesday, April 24th, and we have tons more NBA playoff action to dive into today. We saw finally a couple road teams win last night, with the Pacers defeating the Bucks and the Mavericks defeating the Clippers. So we're going to be diving into both of those games. Plus, we had the Phoenix Suns fall into an 0-2 deficit behind the Timberwolves, despite being favored by Vegas headed into the series. So we're going to dive into the situation surrounding the Phoenix Suns, mostly just focused on this series, but also a little bit big picture, talking about what this means for the Suns as well and their championship window. And then finally, we are going to be ending off the show with the breaking news that the Lions have signed Amon-Ra St. Brown to a new contract extension, making him the highest paid wide receiver in the NFL. So we're going to be diving into all of that. But before we do, just a reminder to like, follow, subscribe wherever you keep up with us. Check us out on socials as well for more exclusive short content. And then finally, for our live viewers, use the comment section to give us your thoughts on the latest happenings in sports. We try and address as many comments as we can here on the GSMC Sports Podcast, make the show as interactive as possible. And if you would consider leaving a tip or donation, you can use the link streaming across the bottom ticker throughout the show. That is gsmcpodcast.net. Anything would be greatly appreciated. I wanted to start off the action from last night talking about the Mavericks Clippers game. It was the last game of the night, and I do think that this is one of the most compelling first round series that we have. I think it has a great chance to go the distance, and a lot of people were sort of, I guess, overreacting some to that first game where the Clippers were without Kawhi Leonard and they still put the whooping on the Mavericks in game one on Sunday. But last night the Mavericks bounced back in what was a real redemption game for them, because again, they kind of got punked when they first played on Sunday. The Clippers defense was just absolutely smothering them. Luka was getting extremely frustrated. You could see the emotions really getting to him. And, you know, when we get into last night's game as well, definitely was feeling the emotions, but was more controlled in them and ended up having a much better game. I know he scored 33 points on Sunday, but a lot of that was in garbage time. I thought he was much more impressive last night in a couple of ways. And really for the Mavs, when it came to their game one loss, outside of a Kyrie Irving led third quarter where he scored 20 points, they didn't have much going for them. And now fast forward to this game last night on Tuesday, the Clippers defense was still very much smothering and they didn't make anything easy. The Clips racked up 9 steals in the game, turned the Mavericks over 13 times, held the Mavericks to just 96 points, but despite that, the Mavericks were able to respond. It was clear from all of the mic'd up moments with Mavericks head coach Jason Kidd that they wanted to play a more physical game and step up to the challenge in the postseason, and they absolutely did so. This was a very physical game on both sides, which is why going into the fourth quarter it was just a 66-65 ball game. But as much as I just talked about the Clippers defense, I thought that the intensity that they showed on that defensive end, going to talk about the role players and how they stepped up in this game, and then just the shot making down the stretch. This did look like a version of a Mavericks team that a lot of people headed into the playoffs were sort of talking themselves into in terms of being a dark horse contender as they finished off the season on a really nice stretch. And now here they are headed back to Dallas with the series advantage. And It's true. Just like in game one, the offense is still very reliant on Luka and Kyrie. What you see when they don't have the ball in their hands, there's not really anybody who can make shots. Now, I think there are a couple different things sort of baked into this. On one hand, you have the crowd, including Charles Barkley, who during the halftime show was talking about how he wants to see Luka be able to play off the ball a little bit more and how he's very hands-on, which is very much true, and that's something that moving forward here, I feel like for Luka to sort of take his game, I mean, he's already at an MVP caliber level, so how many more levels can he go up necessarily? But as things currently stand, I feel like that's sort of his play style, and it's the way that the Mavericks have chose to build around him, which works for the current iteration of their team, and I think they have a great chance of not just winning this series, but potentially making it to the conference finals. But, you know, as for right now, though, it is true that it is very centered around Luka and Kyrie from an offensive perspective. And, you know, again, with this late game execution, we saw, especially last year, obviously Luka and Kyrie didn't get a ton of run together, but in the instances we did see them, it was still very new. It was very clear. There were even some instances where they were trying to get each other looks too much that neither of them really stepped forward as the aggressor. But now, a year and a half later, we've seen that they are so good at playing off of one another, and the late game execution is at a much higher level. And it looked like they were possibly going to be on the ropes in this one in a defensive fight here. The Clippers were building up some momentum. They're at home. They led by 6 points in that fourth quarter. And the Mavericks responded with a 14-0 run to retake the lead, and they didn't give it up from there. What was really interesting to see for me in that final stretch of the game was the fact that Jason Kidd decided to roll with Maxi Kleber as their big man down this final stretch, because Kleber really struggled in game one. He couldn't find his perimeter shot, and the Clippers knew that. They were playing so heavily off him to double team Luka and Kyrie. Kleber wasn't good defensively, and he was kind of a wreck here, but he sort of rectified all of those things in this game where, you know, it's not like he was any sort of a flamethrower. He knocked down 2 threes, which included a three-pointer with just over 2 minutes left, and he played the role he needed to. It was clear they were trying to look for, you know, a defensive lineup out there that was a little bit more switchable. In terms of their big men, you had Daniel Gafford, who was dealing with an injury. He was limited in this game. Derek Lively provided some good minutes, but still just a rookie as far as, you know, that veteran understanding of how to play out on the perimeter and not give up too much. Kleber was just the better option for the Mavericks in this instance, and I do think that the Mavericks are interesting because of the fact that, no, they don't necessarily have a superstar center anywhere on the roster, but they have 3 very viable options for different types of looks and matchups that stand out for them. But Kleber was on the court, and he was not the one that the Clippers were trying to pick on late in the game. The Clippers were trying to get Luka Doncic on the opposing ball handlers, and I thought that Luka did a really good job of holding up on the defensive side of the ball, especially considering the fact that he's asked to do so much offensively as well. And obviously, it's a game that includes both offense and defense, so I don't want to throw Luka a parade necessarily for actually, you know, giving the defensive efforts, but I thought it was really encouraging to see, and, you know, it looked like at times he was really tired out there, but it sounds like he's been much more serious about his conditioning during the off season. He probably still has a little bit, you know, more to go in that department, but even still, I thought he did a really good job holding up on defense down the stretch there. We're far from 48 minutes of really good Luka defense, but he showed some flashes. I thought the backside block that he had earlier in the game when Lively had stepped up, and I believe it was Plumlee, got a wide open look under the rim, but Luka came from behind and blocked him then. There's still some bad tendency things. Again, I'm not saying he's the perfect defender, but he is making some steps to make himself a more well-rounded player. And as much as I said, what are the next levels that Luka can hit, I do feel like there are some marginal things to make him a little bit more well-rounded and take his game to the peak of what he possibly could be if he isn't already close enough to that as things currently stand. But as much as Luka and Kyrie are the initiators for this Mavericks team, I did think that the rest of the role players sort of showed up for them. They played a little bit more Josh Green in this game. I like the energy that he provides off the bench for them, specifically on the defensive side. PJ Washington, I thought that he had a great game, especially down the stretch. He had some big buckets, including a couple corner threes that went to go. I feel like Washington is one of these players, and I don't know what statistic to necessarily look for, but it feels like Washington is always getting the ball with the shot clock winding down, and he's sort of being forced into these grenades. And his percentages aren't necessarily the best in the world, but I think he definitely holds his own. Plus, the level of defense that he has provided just with the length, with the hustle, I do feel like has been a positive for them. Kleba, I already talked about, and the role that he played down the stretch there. Derrick Jones Jr. also providing some solid defense as well. And the Mavericks were just able to hold off the Clippers thanks to some of the creation from Luka and Kyrie, who both got some big-time buckets in this one. And like I mentioned, the Mavericks were dealing with some injuries. Daniel Gafford dealing with a lower back injury earlier in the game. He only ends up playing 9 minutes in this game. He does return, but again, was just much more ineffective. And Tim Hardaway Jr., he exits the game in the second quarter with a sprained ankle, and he did not return. So I thought that this was a really gutsy performance, a nice statement comeback game for the Mavericks, and now they head into their games at Dallas with the series advantage. And on the other end of this game, I thought the Clippers' offense looked really clunky, and the fact that it was so close while they did means that I am not ready to fully write off the Clippers by any means. I think that this is going to be one of, if not the best first-round series, but the Clippers decided to bring back Kawhi Leonard last night, who was listed as questionable headed into the game, had missed 9 straight with right knee inflammation, and it seemed like he had missed a lot of time in this one, specifically in the first half. He just looked really uncomfortable, specifically on the offensive end to me. He was sort of standing around a bunch, not necessarily being an aggressor, not attacking himself. He was decent on defense. He racked up 3 steals in that first half, so not that he was a liability by any means, but it just was clear. It was clear that he was still trying to get his groove back a little bit. I thought he looked more comfortable in the second half, specifically in that third quarter, where he was being more aggressive and getting into the paint. He had a big shot in the fourth as well, as the Clippers were trying to stage the comeback in the closing minutes there. There were some debates about whether or not the Clippers should be looking to bring back Kawhi in this one. I think that this was the right decision. Obviously, you end up losing the game, and that doesn't feel great. But I think that they are going to need Kawhi Leonard in order to win this series. The Mavericks have the star power. Kawhi Leonard can be the big-time difference maker. He's been the difference maker a handful of years ago now, but when the Clippers were facing off against a young Luka Doncic and those Mavericks teams from a handful of years ago, where in back-to-back playoffs the Clippers sent the Mavericks home. And I'm not panicking that the Clippers lost in this game. I understand them trying to bring him back at home, not in a hostile environment, sort of leave LA with that home court advantage still, and it is what it is. They end up dropping this game, but I'm not ready to write them off by any means. Like I said, some of the role players just did not have the same impact in this game too than they did over the weekend. Zubac's stat line was still solid in this one, 13 points, 12 rebounds, but he was struggling with his efficiency throughout the game. He didn't seem like he had the same impact on the interior, and I know that his points weren't that much dramatically higher in game one, but still it just didn't feel like he had that same sort of energy and impact in this one. Terrence Mann was really big for them in game one in the absence of Kawhi Leonard. He saw his minutes dip from 39 to 21 in this game. He wasn't particularly effective necessarily in this game anyways, but something at least to note, obviously tied into the fact that Kawhi's playing time sort of dipped into his playing time, and you're going to prioritize Kawhi Leonard. And for this game, again, the Clippers offense was just really clunky in a lot of these instances where they shot just under 37% from the field on the night as a whole. They were 8 of 30 from 3. And like I said, you can make an argument that they were sort of lucky to be in this game anyways, despite the fact that their offense felt like for a lot of it, the Mavericks should have had, these big leads, but the Clippers were just able to hang in there for a while and up until the final minutes. So the fact that they were so competitive despite looking so bad on offense is why I'm not out on them just yet. But I think this is going to be an incredible series throughout. According to DraftKings Sportsbook, the Mavericks have retaken the series odds. They came into this series favored in terms of the series as a whole. After game one, losing in the way that they did, the Clippers became favored, but it is now shifted back in favor of the Mavericks where they are minus 135. So we have the next game on Friday. This is definitely one of the premier series of the first round. And I'm going to stick with my original pick in the Mavericks. Just out of, I guess, a pride argument. But I do feel like they're going to go back to Dallas. And the big thing I am going to look at is the injuries. There was even a weird instance where it seemed like Luka, off of a jump shot, was sort of dealing with something in his lower leg. But Tim Hardaway Jr., we're not sure what the status is on him going forward. I know that he wasn't a massive part of their team down the stretch of the season, but he is one of those types of players that it feels like in a home playoff game, he has some experience, and he could be somebody who gets hot from three, scores a random 20 points or so. But again, I'm going to roll with the Mavericks as we move on here, but I think this series is going to be potentially a 7-gamer, which is good because I don't know how many of those types of series we're really going to get from this first round, the way that things have started off here. But on that note, we are going to be taking our first break of the show. When we come back, I want to dive into the Phoenix Suns a little bit and their loss to the Minnesota Timberwolves. So stick with us and we will be right back.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I wanna be the greatest. Everybody on the fake shit. I look around and feel like everybody is the fakest. I make this every day and I'm impatient. Hoping one day I blow up from the basement. Statement, the top is so vacant. I don't hear shit that I think is amazing. Waiting for my day when I'm playing. Sold out shows for 1,000 faces. Hey, give me that crown. Get in my way and to be put down. Hitting your place, all this my sound. If I want that shit, then I'll get it right now. I'm losing it, the noose it fits, some moosey shit, a stupid myth. You choose to live or choose to dip, you choose to fight or lose your grip and lose a gift. Oh. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind?
Welcome back into the GSMC Sports Podcast. We just finished up talking about the Clippers Mavericks game 1. Now I want to dive into their game 2, that is. Now I want to dive into the game 2 of the Suns and the Timberwolves and sort of take a look at the situation that the Suns are currently in. We're going to fixate on this series alone, but I do feel like there are sort of some overlying kind of pressures that are on this Phoenix Suns organization. But starting with last night's game, this was close for a lot of the game. It felt like a very similar script to game one, where seemed like the Suns had a good chance for a lot of this, but once they got to the third quarter, Anthony Edwards hit a couple shots. He wasn't great on the night as a whole from a scoring perspective, but then the crowd really started getting into it more, and this Suns offense that, I mean, we saw they were the worst fourth quarter team in the NBA this season, and that definitely kicked in this game where it was just turnover after turnover. They finished with 19 turnovers as a team as a whole, and the Timberwolves scored 31 points off of those turnovers. They were just giving Minnesota all of these opportunities, and for a young team that has home court advantage in the Timberwolves, you just can't give up those types of looks for them and make things easy for them, because it's not like Minnesota's offense has been tremendous necessarily through these first couple games, and yet they are a team that's built off of their defense, the number one defensive rated team in terms of defensive rating, that is, in the regular season this past year. And their offense at times, especially when it gets to those closing minutes, you sort of do have some questions about how they're going to operate. I thought that was going to be one of the biggest things to look at in this series, is what did the late game execution look like. But unfortunately for the Suns, they've been falling apart late in the third quarter, early in the fourth quarter, where they haven't even made it to clutch situations yet. And if they were to, I do, as much as I like the Timberwolves team as a whole more than I like the Suns, in a late game execution, if you're just talking about maybe not the prettiest of plays and you're relying heavily on shot makers themselves, I feel like Durant and Booker are the ones who can deliver more than anyone necessarily on the Timberwolves. And not to be any sort of disrespectful to Anthony Edwards, where I guess I'll sort of transition into him here, because I did think that this was a very interesting Anthony Edwards game. If you look at the regular season, the Suns in their 3 matchups against the Timberwolves held Anthony Edwards to just 14 points per game, shot only 30% or so from the field, and that was the case yet again in this game. Held Anthony Edwards to 15 points on 3 of 12 from 3. It seemed like just with the extra eyes that specifically in transition, I thought that when the Suns defense was, as much as they could be set back up again, which is why I thought that the turnovers hurt them so much. But when they were sort of moving in transition, there were extra eyes on Edwards, and it seemed like Edwards was kind of, I wouldn't say intimidated necessarily, but he just wasn't in the right mindset to actually attack the rim. He was settling for a lot of outside shots, and if you were to just have looked at the box score, you wouldn't think that you could say that he had a bad game, but I don't think that was actually the case if you watched what it was. I feel like what really stood out to me is the fact that I still thought that Anthony Edwards was a big time plus in this game, despite not being a huge scoring threat. The level of defense that he played, the playmaking, because there was so much extra attention on himself, he was able to set up his teammates, and it sort of reminded me of, there was specifically a little period of time, I know that this year is different because of the amount of talent that is on the Boston Celtics, and by default Tatum has to defer more anyways, but I felt like last year, maybe the year before, it was getting to a point where Tatum was the real focal point of the Boston Celtics offense, and it felt like if you could take him out of it, you really limited the Celtics offense as a whole, and that's what we saw in the 2022 finals. And I thought that he came back the next year and had a much better understanding of ways to impact the game without being the go-to scorer every single possession. And that's kind of what this Anthony Edwards game reminded me of, is the fact that he's getting to a point I understand in terms of, sports fandom and media. It's not, the sexiest of games when you look at how Anthony Edwards played, but I thought he was good still. And that was without taking away his biggest threat, which is his attacking downhill and his ability to get to the rim. And yet I still thought that he had a really good game. Really good is maybe pushing it a little bit, but very high on Anthony Edwards, especially after this game. Going to be curious to see, because this series is going to be going back to Phoenix, and I think that the Suns are in trouble as we sort of dive into that conversation, but I also believe that as far as Anthony Edwards, we have seen the Suns be able to limit his scoring all season long. How much is Anthony Edwards going to be able to adjust? If this is what he gives, I can't say it's a bad thing necessarily, but also, he's going to at some point probably be asked to actually come through offensively, because you're not going to be getting Jaden Daniels scoring 25 points on a consistent basis. But shout out to Jaden Daniels, because obviously the quote that's circulating a lot surrounding this series is the fact that I believe it was Anthony Edwards speaking in an interview, and he had said, sure, they have Kevin Durant, but we have Jaden McDaniels. And McDaniels comes out. He was taking defenders off the dribble. Again, I felt like in large part it was because of all that extra attention to Edwards that he was able to find McDaniels in open spots, and it was good. Mike Conley was also massive for the Timberwolves in this game, specifically in that second quarter. He got himself going, had 14 points in the first half on 6 of 8 shooting. So I thought that was really encouraging to see as well. The Timberwolves are a more well-rounded team than I think a lot of people are willing to acknowledge, despite some youth flaws that do sort of surround this team. Last note I'm going to say on the Timberwolves here is weird Karl Anthony Towns game, and ultimately, I'm not trying to bury a player that won his game, but I think that Towns, it's just so frustrating sometimes to see the immaturity with him, despite the fact that, he's definitely not old by any means, but he's been in the league for just about a decade now, and specifically with the fouling, it's just so frustrating at times where, Chris Finch trusted him to play out that the final few minutes of the first quarter while already having 2 fouls, and he picks up a really stupid one, just crashing in from the 3-point line, going out of his way to almost commit this foul, and he picks up 3 before the first quarter is even over. Finch sits Towns for the entire second quarter, and then he picked up another really stupid one for his 4th one in the final seconds of the third quarter as well. So I just feel like some of the maturity stuff with him, I really like the Timberwolves. They're on a great trajectory here. I am curious whether or not Towns is going to be a long-term piece. And if you're a Timberwolves fan and you love Karl Anthony Towns, don't come after me. Yes, I do believe that him and Anthony Edwards can be a great duo. But if you're also a Timberwolves fan, I know you love some Naz Reid, and I don't know. I just sort of have mixed emotions on Karl Anthony Towns. But on the note of the Suns here, because this is back-to-back games where we've seen Devin Booker really struggle to get his shots. The Suns offense as a whole, from that big 3, they got themselves going more in the second quarter for what looked like they could, actually get themselves together. But between Durant, Booker, and Beal, they were just 3 of 15 in the first quarter. Now, I actually really liked what Beal gave them in the second, but really outside of that, then he slipped back into his inefficiency after I think he hit 3 straight shots in the beginning of the second quarter. He had a nice pass to Drew Eubanks, who was much more playable in this game as well if you're looking for something to build on in Phoenix, because Eubanks struggled a lot more in the game 1, and they just overall managed the glass much better, I thought, in this one. They actually out-rebounded the Timberwolves on the offensive end in this game after being completely owned on the glass in game one. But again, it was the turnovers that hurt them. And that's something that it just feels like with the ball movement on this team, it's really just not there in terms of how many possessions are you going to get where there's over 3 passes in the half court. And I know that's sort of a weird number to point to, but it seems like the majority of the time it's an isolation scorer. They're in the top 5 in team isolations during the regular season. And if it's not that, it's just a lot of pick and roll. And I don't know. I just feel like this offense really isn't sustainable through an entire playoffs. And you have Kevin Durant and you have Devin Booker. Take Brad Beal for whatever you want. I've been sort of mixed on him during the regular season. But this is a Suns team that is really bought into winning the championship this year, and it doesn't seem like they're in a great place. According to Hoops Hype, they have the 3rd most expensive roster in the NBA. They are one of the 5 teams that are in that second threshold in terms of how their contract currently stands, and they're actually getting more expensive headed into next season. And again, as things currently stand, at least, they will be the most expensive team in 2025-26. That is 2 years from now, with an older version of Durant and Beal, who have tons of miles on their career, and they have both been dealing with injuries since the turn of the 2020s. So I feel like the Suns, who also don't have a lot of their draft picks, this is a really interesting point to be in, because I hate the conversation surrounding championship windows. I dislike it more in the NFL, because I feel like if you have that, starting quarterback that's elite, it's hard to say that your window is completely closed. And for the NBA, if you have the likes of, a top tier LeBron James, or at this point a Giannis or a Nikola Jokic, you have that Westbrook MVP year in you can be a playoff team and at least get yourself in the conversation. But in terms of actually, being a true contender, the Suns very easily could have missed the playoffs this year, where they were dealing with that play-in threshold for a lot of the year. And I just don't know, in terms of roster flexibility, how they're going to be able to iron this out. Probably going to have to make a trade. Now, Brad Beal, I find it hard to imagine that there are going to be tons of suitors lining up to take on his contract. The Suns got him for practically a bag of chips for this past offseason. And for when you are in that second threshold, you can't trade a player like Brad Beal, who his numbers, he's making this season $46,000. You can't trade him for 2 players making $23 million. You have to actually match up these contracts. So the number of players that he's even going to be available for during the offseason is going to be limited as it is. And it's only going to get more expensive when he's up over $50 million in 2024-25 and 25-26. They just locked down Grayson Allen to a new contract extension. Maybe he's somebody that gets moved, but again, what type of value are you going to get in return that's going to really resurrect this thing? It's just all your eggs are really in the basket for these next 2 seasons, and I wouldn't say, I think that next year is probably one of the last that they can actually be competitive as things currently stand. But they sort of got that new owner syndrome. I believe Ishbia is the new owner that came in during the 2022-23 season and ended up trading for Kevin Durant, made the splash, brought in Brad Beal, again, another splash move during the offseason, and now they're really handicapped in terms of what they can do moving forward here. So again, if the Suns, they still have a chance in this series, I would say. I have a hard time ruling them out entirely, but I was leaning with the Timberwolves to begin with here, and everything I've seen is sort of a red flag. Again, being able to dominate the boards, again, dominate is definitely a stretch, but at least own the boards against the Timberwolves is a massive thing for them, because that was a clear disadvantage for them in game one. The other thing is limiting the turnovers and at least giving yourselves opportunities for these bucket getters that you have to actually put something up. But I don't know, you tell me if I'm being too harsh on them here. Would be very curious to hear what everyone's opinions on this series are. But we're going to be taking our second break here, and when we come back on the other side, going to be looking into the Pacers-Bucks series, where we saw the Pacers bounce back from their game one loss and even up the series headed into Indiana. So we're going to dive into all of that right after the break. Stick with us. We will be right back.
Looking for your daily fix of sports talk without having to pay for it? GSMC Sports Network is available on YouTube. Just search GSMC Sports Network. Get your fix of daily sports talk shows on YouTube, absolutely free. NFL, college football, NBA, MLB, MMA, UFC, fantasy football, and so much more. GSMC Sports Network has shows running all day long, with new sports shows starting every 2 hours. Just like on your favorite cable sports channel, except GSMC Sports Network is absolutely free. Just search GSMC Sports Network on YouTube to catch one of your new favorite shows, like the GSMC College Football Podcast, Chip Shot Football Podcast, Hoops and Heels Women's Sports Podcast, GSMC Basketball Podcast, and so many more. Check it out for yourself. GSMC Sports Network, now available on YouTube absolutely free. Search GSMC Sports Network on YouTube right now.
Welcome back into the GSMC Sports Podcast. We're now going to be diving into the Pacers win over the Milwaukee Bucks, where they took game two and find themselves headed back home with a split series after what looked like a very concerning game one. But they come out in this one, win 125-108. The Bucks were trying to hang in there for a lot of it, but again, in that second half, the Pacers were just able to pull away thanks to a masterful Pascal Siakam game, who has clearly been one of the most sort of underrated pieces in this Pacers offense in terms of the expectations for their postseason. This is a very young Indiana Pacers team. And then you remember the fact that Pascal Siakam was one of the best players from the Raptors 2019 team, and Raptors haven't necessarily been playoff relevant for a couple years now, but he has been such a mismatch in this series early on. He scored 35 points, I believe it was, in game one. Last night, 37 and 11 with 6 assists as well. The Bucks just have no answers for him defensively, and that's the thing, is obviously Giannis is, it goes without saying really that Giannis is incredibly important for the Bucks to be able to win these types of playoff games. But when you look at what the Bucks are doing to try and guard Pascal, they're putting Brook Lopez on him, who, of course, if you have watched Milwaukee Bucks basketball over the past handful of years, Lopez has been one of the elite rim protectors in the league because of some of the systems that Budenholzer ran when he was the head coach of the team, and playing that drop defense, having more aggressive point of attack defenders. And now it's this situation where he is currently matched up against Pascal Siakam, who is sort of, we've seen this for a handful of guys throughout the regular season, but Pascal is one of those athletic, lengthy players with good touch around the rim that Lopez is trying to sag off of him, and Siakam is just ramping himself up with momentum, getting a full head of steam, and going right into the chest of Lopez and finishing over him. We also saw Siakam hit 3 3-pointers, all of them catch and shoot because Lopez is trying to sag off of him, help out in the defense more, or in the paint more, because the Pacers are such a good team at scoring in the paint that he's trying to be involved there and also guard Siakam. The idea is, okay, we can leave Siakam open, but Siakam is shooting something along the lines of 40% on catch and shoot looks this season. Has been a very dramatic turnaround from his early years in Toronto. He's developed, not that he has, the Luka Doncic off the dribble 3-point range, but he is able to knock down shots if you leave him open. And then Lopez started pressing him up a little bit more, and I thought that there were a couple instances of some really impressive, driving in the stop and pops in the paint. Got a couple of those to bounce in. He was looking for mismatches, and any time he had, whether it was Pat Connaughton or Damian Lillard, he was just doing a tremendous job of putting himself in position, and it plays into the fact that the Pacers are such a high-paced team that he is moving out in transition. Typically, the first line of defense in a lot of these transition opportunities can be the guards, and I think that Tyrese Halliburton is finding him in spots where, so I guess shifting off of Siakam here, who I could probably go on about for another 5 minutes because I think he's been so incredible early on, but sort of brings me into the Halliburton conversation where he was better last night than he was in game one, finished with 12 points, 12 assists as well. It feels so different than it did early on in the year, and I feel like a large part of that has to be if once the Pacers are eliminated, we hear that Halliburton was dealing with some sort of serious injury that he hasn't fully recovered from. I believe it was his groin when he first went out during the regular season. He just has not been the same, averaging just 17 points per game after the All-Star break. And again, he's still fine, but it felt like at times, especially when it got into those final minutes, it was Halliburton. He's going to either create a shot for himself. His 3-point shooting was off the charts back in the fall, or he was going to make a great pass to find an open player. And he still does, I think his bread and butter or his backbone, whichever, take your pick. But I think he came up as a little bit more of a traditional point guard. Now, the shot has always been a thing. That has been part of his arsenal, and I still think that it is. He went 3 of 7 last night, so it's not like he was lights out. It's not like he was bad either. But I think that he's just not necessarily the level of creator that we thought that he was going to make that jump of in this season, and it's still fine because he's still a very solid player. The Pacers are a team right now that are, especially when you see the fact that Siakam is having this type of an impact in year one, but only playing the second half of the season with the Pacers, this could be a real threat in the Eastern Conference in years to come. And I still give them a good chance. I picked them over the Bucks headed into the series. It feels like if Giannis isn't going to be back, that again, I don't know how they don't have the personnel, and that's been the conversation around the Bucks all year, is defensively, they just don't have the personnel to actually hold up on that defensive side of the ball. Now, they're starting Pat Bev in a bunch of these games now, and trying to add a little bit more defensive juice to their starting lineup, having Malik Beasley come off the bench, who last night only played 10 minutes, which I feel like tells you how they sort of feel about him, considering the fact that he was one of the best 3-point shooters during the regular season, at least during the first half of the year, and now they just don't really trust him to be matched up against this Pacers team that is trying to run you up and down the court. And I don't know. I think there are adjustments definitely to be made for Milwaukee here. I want to touch on Damian Lillard, who, I had questions a little bit whether or not he had the legs under him still to single-handedly carry a team through a playoff series. And to some degree, I think that single-handedly, with how tough the NBA is now in the year 2024, like those LeBron years where he was running through the Eastern Conference, and some years he had no help. I'm curious whether or not we're ever really going to have that anymore, because it just feels like the level of talent across the league is so much better. But I mean, Lillard was doing everything that he could in the first half, especially. Once again, we saw in game one, he scored 35 points in the first half and put it on the Pacers, ended up getting them into a position where they were just sort of rolling. The Pacers did not look ready, and Lillard was really feeling himself. In this game, once again, we saw Lillard come out really hot in the first half. He scored 26 points. Brook Lopez was also hitting at a pretty decent rate for them as well. That provided some first half offense. But again, when the Pacers adjusted at halftime and put that extra pressure on Lillard, and this is a situation where if the Pacers are going to sort of double down on the Lillard ball handling minutes, maybe you do try and have a little bit more reliable shooters in the game like Malik Beasley. AJ Green actually played more minutes than Beasley in this game with 15 minutes played, only shot 1 3-pointer, and that's typically what he's in the game for. But, you know, it's one of those things where I don't know how much schematically Doc Rivers can even do in a situation like this, but if they're going to find a way to win this series outside of Giannis coming back and putting on his Superman cape and, you know, taking the Bucks to a different level, I find a really hard time talking myself into the argument of how the Bucks are going to be able to win this series. Again, it felt like game one sort of caught the Pacers off guard. This young team that is built off of their offense didn't really have the defensive strategy. They weren't playing great defensively headed into the playoffs anyways, and I know that the Bucks weren't fully trying to take advantage of the paint, but it seemed like they could get going there whenever they wanted to. Felt like it was a different story in this game. I thought that Miles Turner also was a lot better in game two than he was on game one, really on both sides of the ball. The Bucks, this game, it felt like had no chance of really getting to the paint consistently, and that's where Giannis just makes such a big difference because he adds a physical wing on the other end that can match up against Siakam better. He adds a mismatch on the offensive end where he's just this force that requires so much extra attention, especially when he's going downhill and moving towards the paint, which can open up shooters more on the perimeter for the Bucks. But either way, again, I feel like they are definitely up against the odds, and that was the case as soon as Giannis went down with his injury. And it is also one of those things where you definitely want to see Giannis come out and help lead the Bucks to a run here, but you also, with that type of a calf injury, again, overstated at this point almost, but in comparison to the 2019 combination of Kevin Durant's calf injury and then tearing his Achilles, you just want to avoid that as much as possible. And I feel like, I don't know, the Bucks are definitely up against it right now. I'm not sure what they can do with the way that their roster is currently constructed without Giannis. I feel like they're going to need the Pacers to sort of beat themselves more than anything that the team themselves can do. Now, again, you have Damian Lillard, who has the reputation, again, 35 and 34 points in the first two games, though, and it's not like they really have going to step up in a big way. I don't know, if you're just sort of throwing the kitchen sink out there, I like Andre Jackson more than I feel like Doc Rivers does. Andre Jackson just hasn't really gotten much minutes for the Bucks at all during the Doc Rivers tenure of the Milwaukee Bucks season, but with the athleticism, the youth, I feel like he is somebody who can sort of match that energy of the Pacers. But, you know, outside of that, really, I'm not sure what else they can do here. They're an older team, and it just seems like the Pacers they found their confidence in last game. They're going back to Indiana. I feel like that crowd there in Indy is going to be, you know, sneakily electric. I feel like that's another city location that when the team is actually good, I feel like the fans really, really care about it. And I think that Indiana, I mean, Tyrese Halliburton had some words about the Bucks crowd. He said that they had regular season games, which was more of a home court advantage than what the Bucks had during those first two games. There was also a situation, I guess somebody called Halliburton's brother a racial slur, so I don't know if that was just sort of an extra dig that he was trying to throw at Milwaukee, just as sort of a gonna avoid the profanity here, but sort of just throw one last shot at the Bucks fans on his way out of Milwaukee. But we'll see. Let me know what you think about this series moving forward. But now we're going to be taking our final break of the show. And when we come back on the other side, we're going to be moving off of some basketball and just reacting to some of the breaking news from this afternoon about the Lions signing wide receiver Amon-Ra St. Brown to a mega contract extension. So we will be touching on that when we come back on the other side of the break. Stick with us. We will be right back.
For the best and latest podcasts available anywhere, go to the podcast app on your cell phone and type in GSMC to access free content-rich podcasts on health and wellness, book reviews, sports, entertainment, relationships, social media, movies, technology, finance, and even weird news. Subscribe and download the GSMC Podcast Network's family of shows, available everywhere podcasts are found.
Welcome back into the GSMC Sports Podcast. We're going to be finishing off today's show by talking some NFL and reacting to the news that we have a new highest paid receiver in the NFL. Amon-Ra St. Brown agrees to a contract extension with the Detroit Lions, 4 years, $120 million, which matches Tyreek Hill in terms of annual value of a contract, but the $77 million guaranteed makes him officially the highest paid receiver in terms of guaranteed money. So this is a move that isn't all too surprising that he was going to get paid. St. Brown has been an absolute monster for the Lions since being drafted in just the 4th round of the 2021 draft. He was going to be coming up on a contract extension, and this past year he puts together an all-pro first team performance where he had career highs in receptions, yards, touchdowns, all across the board. He was incredible, and I think that this is very much warranted. Amon-Ra St. Brown, just 24 years old, so tons of time left on his deal as well. I know that big boss at the company, Andrew Tate here at GSMC, thinks that he can be the best wide receiver in the NFL. I feel like that's hard to sort of claim when you live in a world with Justin Jefferson sort of in that same stratosphere coming out in the same draft, I believe they were. Jefferson was actually 2020, but also 24 years old, going to be turning 25 headed into next season. So I don't know if I necessarily see Amon-Ra taking over the crown from Jefferson, but either way, Amon-Ra St. Brown has the chance of being, he already is a top tier wide receiver, and he has done wonders for the Lions to help sort of turn their franchise around in these years with Dan Campbell. Having the threat of St. Brown on the outside has also very greatly impacted the play of Jared Goff, who coming into this season, or really coming into his Lions tenure as a whole, he was seen as somebody who was on a contract that was really bad, and that the Lions were probably just going to take on this contract as a part of the Stafford deal and play it out, end up drafting his replacement. But it now seems like Goff is going to be the long-term starter there. At least he's going to get another contract, I would imagine. Going to be an expensive one, which does sort of fall into a conversation of how much are you willing to pay Goff. Now, the quarterback market obviously always only goes up and up as the years go on here, but It's going to be interesting to see where he falls. I would imagine it's going to be in the top 10 quarterbacks in the NFL. Now, $40 million, $50 million. I know that sounds like a lot for Goff, and, I'm not necessarily in love with the idea necessarily, but if you have one of these front-loaded contracts where you end up giving Goff about 4 years and, he's making a lot of that money on the back half where it's less guaranteed, I feel like it would be almost a little bit of a no-brainer. The Lions think that they are Super Bowl contenders next year, and I do too. So I'm not saying it's delusional or anything, but they were just in the NFC Championship game. They had a really good chance of making the Super Bowl if they hadn't sort of fallen apart there at the end, and I feel like they have this opportunity where it's so rare that a team like the Lions sort of comes up in such an explosive way over a 2-year span. Really, you can call it a 1.5-year span because they were bad. They were 1-6 or something along those lines to start off the 2022 season, and then ended their season on the high note and only ramped up as the season went on here. But for the Lions to explode like that and to be able to hold on to both your offensive and defensive coordinators is a pretty rare thing. And it's because, Ben Johnson, their offensive coordinator, who was really being said that it was a lock that he was going to be coaching the Washington Commanders moving forward, that he said he wanted to come back and have another chance to win a Super Bowl here. And maybe it's partially in due to the fact that Washington wasn't the most appealing job to him ever, even though they have the number 2 overall pick, and he could have potentially moved forward with his own quarterback and, whatever. But at this point, we're all speaking hypotheticals because he's back in Detroit, and it seems like they are really locked in. And as I'm sort of looking into this now, I didn't even realize as I was coming into the show, I knew about the St. Brown extension that was signed a few hours ago. They actually just 30 minutes ago as well signed offensive tackle Penei Sewell to a deal that looks like it is 4 years, $112 million. Sewell is one of the best offensive linemen in the NFL already. So another, top position player that they end up paying. Sewell was really, it seemed like before the 2020 college football season started, it seemed like Sewell was going to be one of the top 3 players off the board, but then the quarterbacks really started building up a reputation for how good they were. Now, obviously, only one of them actually held up. You had some surprise moves in there, such as Kyle Pitts being selected 4th overall. But Sewell has been an absolute monster for Detroit. He's coming off an all-pro season himself. I think that he is a lock to be one of the best offensive linemen for at least probably another decade, because he was really young when he was coming into the NFL. He played the 2021 rookie season as a 21-year-old, and he's already increasingly gotten better over the past couple years, which is super encouraging to see. So, again, Jared Goff now, it seems like, is really that last domino to fall in terms of what type of a contract are they going to give him. But definitely very encouraging here for the Lions. And if you're not necessarily fully married to Goff in terms of being a franchise quarterback, which I can understand some hesitations. It's very rare you see somebody have the start of his career like Jared Goff did and be able to turn himself into a real impact player that is capable of winning you playoff games. I thought that he was good through their entire playoffs here, and no, they maybe didn't win the playoff games. I got into an argument with one of my friends at the time saying, how can you put that on Jared Goff at all? No, their offense wasn't necessarily tremendous down the stretch of the game, but there were so many other things that went wrong for the Lions in terms of some unlucky bounces. Obviously, the deep shot that I think Ayuk ended up catching that set the Niners up in the red zone. There was the fourth down decisions in terms of going for it instead of the field goals. I didn't think that those were necessarily his fault. Now, maybe you wish Goff would have executed better, and maybe you argue that, if you're going to pay $40 million to somebody, then they should be able to make those plays. But their receivers were also dropping passes, and I also thought that the decision at the end of the game in terms of calling the timeout when they were in the red zone as well was a really bad move for them. So again, just sort of running through the reasons why they lost that NFC Championship game. I can name a handful of things that I am putting on the Lions before I'm blaming Jared Goff himself. Now, again, the questions surrounding how much is he going to be paid is going to be a big one, but I don't know. I think that the Lions are in a really good position moving forward here. They drafted so well last year, and all of their returning rookies going into second year should be impact players. And if I can quickly look up here what type of draft capital the Lions have in this upcoming season. I mean, if they can replicate the success they had in last year's draft, specifically in those first two rounds with it was Laporta, it was Gibbs, it was Brian Branch, and it was Jack Campbell. All four of them were really impactful players. And they have 3 picks in the first 3 rounds again. So we will see how this all sort of plays out for them, but I feel good about the Lions moving forward. I do still think that the NFC is very gettable, and I think that it was sort of a no-brainer move for both St. Brown and Sewell, which, again, I didn't even know when I was coming into this segment that news had broken during the show. So a lot of encouraging stuff to see for the Lions. You have to commend, I believe Brad Holmes is their general manager, and the way that they have been able to turn this franchise around after some really rough years in Detroit, and Lions fans clearly are absolutely loving it. They are one of the most fun football environments in the NFL today, and should be interesting to see. They have the number 29 overall pick in tomorrow's draft, which, as we wrap up this show, is just a reminder that we're going to be live tomorrow at 2 p.m. Eastern through 3. We're going to be doing all types of draft coverage, biggest questions. We have some very interesting rumors surrounding the LA Chargers at pick number 5 and what they may do. So we have all types of draft coverage, plus the NBA games that will be taking place tonight in both the Celtics versus Heat and the Thunder versus the Pelicans, all of that tomorrow. So definitely be sure to tune in then. As for today, though, that is all we have time for. Thank you very much for tuning in to the GSMC Sports Podcast. Thank you to the GSMC Sports Network for allowing us to host this show. We will be live one last time, 2 p.m. Eastern tomorrow afternoon. We will see you then. Thanks for tuning in.
Let's go. I wake up to a little bit of drool on my pillow, feel like it's gonna be a bad day. Yeah, I'm tired of shit, and the coffee ain't hit yet, damn.